All right, we're recording, and then I'm gonna let people in. You guys ready? We'll just banter for a little bit, and then Blake can take it away.
Yeah. Wait till you hit about 200, Pat, and then start going.
Yeah, high 100s I think is fine for. Yeah, we'll see it. Here we go.
Right.
And there we go. Should have people coming in. And I'll just share. Let me just get that master screen up again here.
Oh yeah, thank you.
You guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Awesome. It's always nice when it just works, you know, it starts flowing. Yeah. You're like stressing the last 30 minutes and we're off. Here we go.
Yeah, at this point, you're just like, all right, now we're moving.
You're just waiting for people to come into the room at this stage, Pat? Yeah.
Yeah, we can just chat and just hang out for a second, then wait for people to filter in within a couple minutes usually, and then Blake can get us going.
All right, I'm just going to top up my coffee. Don't stress.
Oh yeah, yeah. We probably, Mike, we probably have maybe 5 to 10 minutes of talking before we're ready for you. So.
All right. Okay. I'm here and listening. I'm just topping up coffee.
All right. Sounds good.
Pat, did you get outside at all today?
I was doing some work today for Uncle Sam.
Nice.
And a little bit outside. I was just doing some surveys today, some ecological stuff.
Great.
Yeah, so it's nice. I mean, it's been raining the last 2 days pretty hard, so it's nice to have it settle out a little bit.
Was it as windy and rainy over there as it's been?
Yeah, I didn't look at what the precip totals ended up being, but it was well over those last 2 days. It was probably well over 1.5 inches of water.
Wow. Some colder temps could have been special.
Yeah, I was wondering about, because it started off kind of cold and the summit had some snow. You could see the webcam, and if you checked early in the morning, you could see like some of the observers' footprints out on the deck. And then over the next like 3 hours that if you were checking, the snow just kind of started dissipating.
Yeah.
Turned to rain.
I think it was, what, 2 or 3 years ago that Hermit Lake got 18 inches or so. Google Photos just reminded me of that fact.
It's like 2018 maybe?
Yeah, that's probably it.
Got snow on the ground there already, guys?
Not yet. We were just talking about that. We had a little bit up high, but it's gone at this point.
Yeah. So same here. It's actually really nice autumnal weather, kind of low 60s, blue sky.
Yeah, I saw some. Are you in the UK or are you in Chamonix right now?
Chamonix, yeah.
Yeah, I saw some maybe a couple weeks ago. Some of the local guides there, just on social media, kind of getting after it. I don't know if there was an early storm or anything, or. Yeah,
they're just using the really high lifts that run all year to get up to kind of about 11,500 feet on the Midian. But you know, it's all spray. It's mini golf. They're just it's mini golf they're doing up there. They're getting like 500 feet shots, 600 feet shots for some, for the ground, and that's about it. and then yeah, I mean, you can yo-yo some nice days, and then they just download on that higher lift. But it's, you know, you're into it straight away, so it's kind of a fun day on a sunny day after a storm.
Their version of an early season left gully run.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's super open crevasse wise, so they have to be. There's very little other than kind of very benign mini golf to go at.
Yeah, just enough snow to cover all the holes.
Yeah. You just keep it, just even not even going anywhere. You know, well, you know, people get out. There's last year about this time, a group of 5 guides and pro skiers were up doing just exactly the same thing and managed to get themselves avalanched and beaten up pretty badly. Yeah, we've not had a proper storm through yet. We've had bits and pieces, but it's the same as you. It's just melted away.
That early season stuff's always a little extra exciting with the rocks and whatnot about, and I guess cracks too for you.
Yeah. We run our first course in about 3 weeks' time, and it's high where we go, but I've written off 2 sets of skis, and one of our guides that was on the course managed to break a leg just skiing into a rock under a couple of feet of powder, just smacking into it. So yeah. It's tough because the stoke's high and it's really nice powder, and you just like just hold off.
So I think unfortunately a few people have actually sent me messages, both one on here and a couple emails. It sounds like there's a power outage in southern New Hampshire, southern New England, so we might be short some people, but it's 6:07, so we could probably get it rolling, Blake, if you want. Hopefully people are able to tune in or get power back.
Yeah, I hope so. All right, Pat, thanks. Let's get started, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, those of you that are. I wanted to first and foremost thank you for joining us last night as well. I haven't thought about diurnal recrystallization in a while, probably since somewhere about last March. So it was nice to have those parts of our brains going again. And one of the things I actually really appreciated was a text thread today with somebody just kind of going back over what we learned during the presentation on beacon use and beacon work. And I just really encourage everybody to continue the learning that we're going to engage in here tonight outside of this, outside of this setting, because that's really what this is all about. Thank you again to all of our sponsors, the American Avalanche Association, DPS Skis, Patagonia, Tuckerman Brewing Company. Thank you, Pat, for organizing all of this and getting us here in the right place at the right time. Really appreciate it. And a couple housekeeping items for tonight. The questions, we really, and we are kind of quick meeting before this, we were talking about how much we appreciated not only how many questions there were, but the quality of questions. But if you don't mind helping us all out and by entering those questions into the Q&A, so that's at the bottom far right of your screen, that just helps us organize them a little bit so we're not going back and forth between the chat and the Q&A questions. We'll do raffle prizes between talks tonight. We'll do one between talks. We'll do one at the end. And then really the big announcement for this evening that I have for everybody is that we are going to be merging Friends of Tuckerman Ravine and the White Mountain Avalanche Education Foundation. So this has been in the works for a little while now. Both organizations have a very similar mission, which is to support obviously our forecasters and all the work that they're doing. And obviously we have some different events that go on throughout the year. But we really think that we can probably do a better job if we bring those forces together and really kind of hone in on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so, yeah, it's been a lot of work, but we're really excited about the path forward. A couple of things there is that we will really be asking more involvement from you all as we move forward. That's kind of what keeps both organizations going. So please stay tuned for ways to get involved. And also we will have an in-person kickoff party. At least there's a rumor about that, but I'm going to make sure that rumor becomes a reality. So stay tuned for dates and times so we can all celebrate the merging of these two organizations and our collective work together. That will happen sometime before or right as snow starts to fall. It'll be great to see everybody in person. With that, I think those are all the notes I have for this evening. Frank, can you introduce our speakers for tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to welcome Mike Austin from across the pond. Mike is a certified aspirant ski guide living in Saint-Gervais, right outside of Chamonix in the valley there. You'll notice his accent is not French. He recently retired there from Scotland and has been living the dream working as a guide and avalanche instructor there around Mont Blanc with an organization called Avalanche Geeks. And Mike tonight is going to talk about their interesting and deadly season last year, which unfortunately mirrored ours to some extent. So take it away, Mike.
Hi, let me see if I can get my screen up there. Thanks, Frank. All right, is my screen up there, Pat? It's looking good? Great. Okay, so I guess the first question that might be on folks' mind is why am I looking at a season retrospective of the French Alps when I'm sitting in on an ESOL group of lectures? I think Frank asked me to present because we had such an interesting season out here, and there's quite a lot of crossovers and learning points that are mirrored in what's been happening in America in the last season, and some interesting phenomena that are worth kind of bearing in mind, some behaviors and some snowpack issues. So let's dive straight in. And as Frank alluded to, it was a particularly bad season here in Europe. I know in the States as well. It was a particularly bad year as well. I think he had 37 fatalities in the US last year. And in France alone, we had 40. And in neighboring countries, I think the total figure was considerably higher. And the reason for that were a number of things. We had a really unusual snowpack in so much as we had a sand event that came through in early February. And then we had a setup of depth thaw that set up early in the season in a classic way and really didn't go away for large parts of the French Alps. And under the umbrella, this was all happening under the umbrella of COVID restrictions. And I'll explain more what I mean about that. So the restrictions that we had here in France were particularly restrictive, and that certainly played in on some of the behaviors by people going out skiing and recreating what they could and what they couldn't do and where they were being forced to recreate. So just as a snapshot there, you can see on the far right is the figure of 40 deaths. And you can see the trend, like a lot of the world has been going down over recent years. There's some outliers there. You can kind of dismiss in so much as some of them are infrastructure failures, multiple casualties that aren't necessarily recreational skiers, housing being hit, certainly back there in the late 60s and early 80s, that's definitely the case. So we spiked, we're about 50% with 40 fatalities. We're about 50% above what we would normally expect in the French Alps in a normal winter. Some of the figures that I'll be talking about are fairly mind-blowing. You need to put these figures in the context of the density of population that recreate in the mountains here. It's quite a large percentage. It's a mainstream sport to go ski touring, to go snowshoeing. It's not an outlying sport at all. So we have large population bases putting large volumes of people into the mountains. So you need the context of that as well. But we're about 50% above what we'd normally expect to see fatality-wise in a normal winter season. And that's the breakdown of it there. Large amount of incidents, large amount of fatalities, 135 incidents. And when by talking about incidents, these are reported incidents that have been logged by authorities. So they've necessitated an emergency call in to a first responder of some description. And that's been recorded there. So it doesn't count all of those dozens, hundreds of incidents that people have got away with, near misses, involvements. Certainly, we'll talk about a couple of involvements that I had or I was witness to this winter that wouldn't have been included in those figures. So again, huge numbers, but we need to keep that in context of the huge numbers of incidents and accidents, but with a vast amount of people going up. And that was particularly notable this year because some of these restrictions are so restrictive, people start to do all kinds of weird things. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to give you guys a little context of where we're talking about and what we're going to be talking about. So here's a map of Europe, and you can see this is the area here that we're talking about. It's referred to as the Western Alps. And the prevailing weather directions are coming from the northwest. Our storms to this part of the Alps come in from this northwest stream, generally coming cold, but we get secondary weather patterns coming up from the south that generally pile into this part of the Alps. It's an intermountain snowpack that we have. Further east you go in the Alps, over towards Austria, and to the east of Switzerland, it has more continental aspects. But where we are, we're on an intermountain kind of snowpack. So that gives you some kind of mindset of what kind of snow we're dealing with here. And the area in particular that we're going to be talking about is around Mont Blanc. So the border between France and Italy it runs right through Mont Blanc along this chain here. And to the left, we have France, to the right, we have Italy, and to the north, we have Switzerland. We're at the confluence of three countries. And again, this plays into some of the behaviors that happened in the Alps this year. And around here, Montjoli, this is kind of where a lot of the skiing that I did this season got done. So I've kind of talked about France's COVID restrictions, and we went into a secondary lockdown here in mid-October, and all French ski lifts closed. But interestingly, just across the border, Switzerland kept their lifts turning. In addition to that, we were under curfew, but perhaps the biggest influence on people's behavior in the mountain was this ban on travel. You weren't allowed to move more than about 15 miles from your home address to recreate. So that had a profound influence of where people could go to chase snow, to chase conditions, and to chase terrain. Now, bear in mind that lifts were also closed. So all of those recreational skiers that would normally run the lifts were going out and buying ski touring equipment and then ski touring within the local vicinity. So vast amounts of inexperienced skiers in the mountains, and people being funneled into areas which they may not necessarily go. And for the regular locals, they were now looking for conditions and snow and terrain that they were having to share with vast numbers of other people for the first time. So they with themselves were getting displaced into more remote and potentially not desirable ski areas to find virgin snow, to find clean snow and quiet ski runs. So we can already see how these COVID restrictions are affecting people's behaviors. just by these restrictions. Here's a timeline of what happened in the Western Alps. And by the Western Alps, I'm talking about that area of Mont Blanc region with Switzerland just to our north. Verbier is maybe 15, 20 minutes drive, half an hour's drive from the French border. As the crow flies, probably 30, 40 miles from Chamonix. And I'm including the Italian side in this Western Alps as well. And at the bottom left, you can see here the season totals. France is 40 deaths, Switzerland just over the border, 32, and Italy just over the border, 27. So just within this concentrated area of 3 countries, we're talking in the region of what's that, about 90 deaths, is it? What's that, 70, 40, 60, 100 deaths, just within that region in this winter. So we'll keep popping back to this timeline, but let's just kind of get into it. It kind of started early, as it often does, up high, and the first kind of incident report of avalanche involvement happened really early in the season, just after one of the first snowfalls, when 5 guides and professional skiers were all out together as a group and got themselves avalanched just on the Italian side. And classic early season avalanche, in so much as the injury profile involved fractures and injuries to limbs from being dragged through shallow snowpacks and through rocks. And this was a portent of the sea to happen. You could argue this was also a behavior that may or may not have been influenced by some of these restrictions coming in. And I say it's not, because people going up and skiing these high peaks after a first snowfall is quite common here. But secondly, I say it could have been because the countries were closing borders. You're not supposed to move between France and Italy. You're not supposed to move between France and Switzerland. So this may have played unconsciously or subconsciously of, well, there's lifts turning in Italy. They're going to close down in a week or 2. Let's go get a run over there. Conditions may not be optimal. I don't know. I'm surmising on that, but this was the first incident that happened early in the season. Around that snowfall that we had end of October there, as with a lot of snowfalls around the world, certainly we're maybe seeing that in the Western states right now. These early season snowfalls in October are kind of an avalanche forecaster's bogeyman, in so much that people get pretty stoked about getting early season turns, but we kind of worry about what that early season snow on north steep shady aspects are going to do. And because that snow will just sit there, it won't get any more snow on top of it for a while, and that snow starts to rot out, right? And so we got that snowfall and around the 8,000 feet area, and went up to have a look at that. And interestingly, that snow wasn't doing that there. But around 8,000 feet, below 8,000 feet, the snow that was on the ground, because of temperature inversions, it started to, it was quite warm up high where the snow had fallen. That snow started to melt and consolidate. But if you went much higher again, it was staying and starting to facet. It was staying cold and it was faceting out. So we're starting to see right from the very beginning of the season, 2 quite different snowpacks starting to establish themselves initially. Below 8,000 meters, that early snow turned to an ice crystal form. And above 8,000 feet, it started to facet. So there's just, you can see there, about 8,000 feet, this snow here became icy and very solid. And the season just kind of set off as in a normal way. The lifts don't start turning anyway in France till middle to late December, but they weren't going to run at all this year. And for a lot of our season, we skied in what was resort. We push into the backsides of these resorts where it was gladed, and we were getting some very nice snow early on in the season. Very little or to no avalanche danger, because all we had was a single depth of a foot of snow, powder, crystalline snow on that, some cases on that hard icy base, but nice skiing and just a general start to the a normal start to the season. However, above that, there was already from higher resorts where people were touring, and on the Swiss side where the lifts are starting to run, we're getting reports coming in of avalanches popping down to those faceted layers from the month before, from the end of October. People were starting to pop off little slabs into the basal layers, which was faceting away and starting to turn into depth all down there. But where we were lower than 8,000 feet, we were getting very stable conditions. And there's an example there. If you've not got experience of reading a snow profile, then I definitely encourage you to take a level 1, level 2, and spend a little bit of time delving into some of these profiles, because they're quite useful in getting a snapshot of the snowpack for a particular area on an aspect at an elevation. And I'll not go in and explain how they work if you're not in any great depth, but you can see at the bottom there, we have the hardness of the snow, fist, 4 fingers, 1 finger, pencil and knife, that's the hardness. And then we have the depth of the snow here. And off to the right, we have the crystal type. So we can see down on the basal layers, and we're below 8,000 feet, we've got a kind of an icy form with a few facets above it, a little sandwich there. And then we've got about 1 meter of snow in total depth. And over here, we've got a compression test saying that on the 27th hit on the compression test, there was a resistant planar and RP released at 35 centimeters off from the ground. So certainly this is a layer of concern lower down, but it was pretty stable. We weren't getting much of any interest. It was just starting off as a pretty normal winter at this stage. Snow kept coming down, little and often, just how we liked it. And we were getting some good skiing. It was nice. It was setting up nicely. But again, from further north, 50, 60 miles away, over that border in Switzerland, we were getting reports of these dumps of snow setting off avalanches down into those basal faceted layers. And already from Switzerland, fatality reports were starting to drift in, which is kind of interesting, because we were seeing very little where we were 50 miles away, because our resorts around where we were skiing were that much lower. And remember what I said about the travel restrictions, is people, even if they knew that the snowpack conditions were safer in where we were 50 miles further south, they were restricted to come to us. There was, as these deaths started to mount up, it's kind of an interesting snapshot into the mindset of different cultures and how they view things. There was an interview with a French colonel from the PGHM, the government police mountain rescue that they have in the high mountains here, and he was being interviewed about fatalities starting of ski tours happening in COVID, and there was a certain degree of concern, I said, about people that had very little or no backcountry or touring experience going into the resorts, where there was little bits of control going on within the grounds of the resorts, but not much. It certainly wasn't a protected area like it would be in the States. The way patrol in a normal winter in Europe will mitigate avalanches is to protect the peace, not necessarily protecting everything inside the boundary of the ski resorts. They'll only look to protect the peace. However, this winter just gone, because of the restrictions and the piste weren't running, the only mitigation that was going on was done to protect infrastructure, mountain huts, the lift lines themselves. So it's not that there was no control going on, but it was very haphazard, certainly no patrol. And you get to the trailhead, the car park of the ski resort, first thing in the morning, and we learned very quickly that we needed to make alpine starts. We did not want to turn up at the trailhead at the car park at 8 or 9 o'clock because it was just a complete bun show. It was kind of frightening what people were kind of going about and doing. People skinning up with Gucci handbags over the shoulders, in Ralph Lauren ski suits with furry collars, small children being pulled behind them on toboggans with the kids' skis on their backs. Lots of people hiking with the downhill setups off into the backcountry. And initially at the beginning of the season, we thought, oh, there's going to be just a lot of these instances of fatalities are going to involve these people, but actually it didn't. They kind of self-regulated themselves. They'd go up the front side of the ski resort to the top of a run and ski back down, and what was and is a piste. And even though it wasn't a groomed piste, it was generally skier compacted and was perfectly safe. Very rarely would these complete amateurs and novices venture further back in these low resorts. The problem is in the higher resorts, when you're starting off at 9,000 feet, they're instantly into fairly challenging avalanche terrain. So this photograph here, for example, is we've set off at 6 o'clock in the morning. But remember, with the restrictions because of COVID, there's a curfew on. So even that is inhibiting what you might want to do in relation to your behaviors, to avoid other people, to give yourself a margin of time in the day, a margin of not having other people above you, and let it's Hobson's choice. Are you going to break the law and go at 5, or and go further, somewhere more remote, or are you going to be a good citizen and potentially place more risk in the mountains at your disposal? So these were decisions we were having to make all the time. But low down, again, below 8,000 feet, conditions were good. And at the back of these resorts, you'd leave the pink handbags and the toddlers in the onesies being pulled up on plastic sleds. And even though we were in resort, we were getting good rewards below 8,000 feet. We were getting great turns and safe turns. They felt really solid and safe turns. Little avalanche hazard present. Going back to what I was saying about that 8,000 foot area, 7,500 feet area where we were in the valley at that lower level, the basal layers were an ice layer. Higher up, there were faceted layers. So now the same snowpack at the same elevation as the last one you saw there, you can see this facet layer is already starting through temperature gradient and compression from above is starting to dissipate itself. It's starting to disappear, and we have a nice, safe, homogeneous pack forming here. And you can see just down here, no results from compression testing at all. A lovely, correct side up snowpack. And yet 50 miles further north, higher up, depth hoar is forming because this didn't have the opportunity to turn to ice early in the season. It stayed as facets, and those facets just continued to grow above that elevation. So below 8,000 feet, we started pushing into steeper, more committing lines, and it felt absolutely fine. We were getting good skiing, going right to the edge of where we could do in our 20 kilometer radius. good rewards and good days around that Christmas, New Year period time. So this is where we are now, Christmas, New Year. And it goes very cold. It goes blue sky and cold for about a week. And we start picking up some nice big surface hoar, big feathery crystals on the top of our snowpack. And this surface hoar is widespread. It's not just below 8,000 feet, but further over in Switzerland, and then the higher mountains around Chamonix, the surface hoar has gone right up to 10, 11, 12,000 feet. So now if you think about their snowpack with the basal facets at the bottom, and then a normal snowpack on above as a slab, now we're putting large surface hoar on top of that. Whereas where we were, we've got our ice at the bottom, our dissipating facets that more or less gone, a correct pack that's the right way up with, look how big these feathery surface hoar crystals are. And for those of you who have taken a level 1, surface hoar is an extremely insidious weak layer. We talk about structural defects within our snowpack, and they would be a layer of less than 10 centimeters, a faceted grain type, a hardness difference, a size difference. Surface hoar generally ticks all of those lemons, if you like, those yellow flags that Ari talk about. Surface hoar is an insidious layer once it's buried. It's on the top. It's like skiing through broken glass. It's fine, it's fun, and it's not dangerous at all. You'll hear it. They refer to it over here, by some people refer to it as loud snow, because you can actually hear the crystals breaking. They're so large as you ski through them. But now we're going to put a new dump of snow on top of them. If that snowfall that comes in doesn't come in with a wind or with a warm temperature, that will knock them down. If they stay in that vertical axis and we put a layer of snow on top of them, an extremely fragile layer that can collapse and initiate large avalanches, size 3 avalanches. So this was what we're setting up. And sure enough, after a week of snow, we got a storm coming in, and you can see here the amount of snow we've had, because if you look at that photograph, you can see that's the new snow from the storm collapsing on that surface hoar. And this is a snowplow set that off a road cut. And then sure enough, higher up in the mountains above that 8,000 feet layer differential between the two different snowpacks, you're now having that step down to the depth hoar. So we were running Avalanche courses at the time. We managed to run, I think, we run a really limited program last year because of the restrictions. Were the courses going to go ahead? Weren't they going to go ahead? Could people travel to us? Couldn't they travel to us? We ran a handful of courses, managed to squeeze them in. And with that buried surface hoar layer, we were getting great results. It was fantastic learning. Here's a photograph of myself, and I'm just isolating an extended column test, and it's going as ECTV. That's an extended column test that's collapsed just on cutting. I've not even hit it with a shovel yet. I've not even waved a shovel in its direction. Just on cutting, it's popped straight out of the pit at me. And we were seeing some of the most reactive results we'd seen in years. So super exciting for us to get results like that. Great for the students to have to negotiate terrain like that, because with such a widespread avalanche problem on multiple aspects, terrain selection was super important to them. So it was great. They were having to choose very safe terrain, not being threatened above where they wanted to ski, keeping the angle down constantly under 30. Now, at the same time, as we were running these courses, people were going up the lifts in Verbier in Switzerland, just over the border, just 50 miles away. And they went into a massive avalanche cycle, skier triggered, and they went into a whole bunch of incidents, skier triggered incidents, including multiple deaths. 7 deaths in the Verbier area and the Valais area, just over the border from Chamonix in a 10-day period, including 2 mountain guides. And it was interesting. Social media lit up. People were referring to black swan type events, and it was complete nonsense. So I'm the co-owner of Avalanche Geeks, and my partner just says, like, you know, so just don't say anything. Just bite your lip. And unfortunately, it's not in my nature, and I was just like, I was biting my lip and biting my lip, and eventually I just kind of responded on social media. And it's like, this is not a black swan event. You have depth haul. You have slab of snow above it, and you've got surface haul with storm snow above that. What do you think is going to happen here? You've got a pack of cards that are just teetering on the brink, and of course you're going to have a widespread avalanche cycle going on. Nothing else is going to happen after you have 20 millimeters surface haul and a 2 foot of snow on top of it. What do you think is going to happen? And is that going to step down to your depth haul? Occasionally it will. And you will see large avalanches. So the behaviors around this storm cycle were very, very poor. And SLF, the Scottish, the Swiss avalanche forecasting service, were calling the same thing. They were forecasting high, and they were talking about a very deep persistent slab problem with 4 millimeter size depth form, a 10 centimeter basal layer of 4 millimeter size depth haul, and above it was surface haul with storm size up. It was being forecast. It was a clear loaded gun, and people were just throwing themselves at it. And here's an example of some of the pits that SLF were posting from around that time, a few days before. Look at this here now. So ignore the blue. The blue is from ram resistance. The gray is the harness. Here's a crust here. Depth haul, facets below a crust, facets above the crust. A really unstable snowpack, all around that 8,000 feet mark. Over here, exactly the same. Different area in that valley, just over the border in Switzerland, exactly the same. Snowpack here is compared to the I was showing you from the lower elevations, just 50 miles further. 2 very different snowpacks. Just out of interest, the Swiss avalanche surface, they score using the Rouge block still. They don't use the ECT, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that they've always done that, and that gives them a historical record. So you'll see the Rouge block results here as 2s and 3s. This one over here is 5, and just it's kind of fallen out of favor, especially in North America, because it's such a slow test to conduct. But the Swiss really like it, and some of the stuff they've done shows that it correlates better with snowpack stability than an ECT. But it's such a slow test that you get no skiing done if you were going to go out and do it. But basically, we say any Rouge block scores of 1 to 3 is associated with unstable conditions. So number 1 is isolating the block. Number 2 is just gently approaching the block. And then you stand on a large block and you weight it with your skis and see the quality of the shear. So if you look back, they were getting clean shears on just approaching the block, not surprisingly. And then they're also getting some harder harder failures, but also on clean shears. So a very suspect snowpack leading into that event of 7 fatalities in 10 days. So we went through that cycle, and then just a couple of days later, we woke up to Armageddon. So COVID's running rife throughout Europe. Restrictions are everywhere of where you can go. We're signing forms just to go to get groceries that we have to present to the gendarmerie if we get stopped out in our vehicles. And then we woke up to this. This is 10 o'clock on a morning on Chamonix High Street, and there's no filter here. It's just the sky is orange. The sky is blood orange. What's going on? What's going on is a sand event. And then what we're looking at here is a photograph of Europe. Just over here is the Alps. This is Italy, with the boot of Italy, with Sicily down there. This is North Africa. And you can see all of this sand is blowing from the south, blowing north from the Sahara across the Mediterranean, and is coating the Alps in a layer of very fine sand, but quite a thick layer, like a 1 centimeter, half centimeter, 1 centimeter layer. It's completely coats the mountains in this orange layer of sand. And that's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. How's that going to affect the snowpack? And I kind of initially, I didn't think it would affect the snowpack that much, because just a day or so later, it snowed on top of that sand and buried that sand layer in the snow. And I thought, wow, well, you know, if it's staying as orange on the surface, that's definitely going to affect how it absorbs heat and energy, and I can see that affecting the temperature. But now that it's buried, it'll be okay. But interestingly, some of the research that's come out of Italy, but also out of Colorado, where they get these dust events as well in and around San Juans, is that these layers can be really problematic. They can really affect and change the temperature profile within a snowpack. And they continue to do that, even buried 20 or 30 centimeters. They can be that much underneath the snow of new snow and still be having an effect on the temperature gradient. And it's not very well understood on how and why, but the consensus and the evidence is coming through from studying these events. And there's just a couple of papers on it, but the consensus is that they form melt freeze crusts around them. And if you throw your mind back to what Don Sharaff was talking about yesterday, melt freeze crusts are a definite problem layer within our snowpack. We get faceting below them, and we get faceting above them. They affect the temperature gradient. And sure enough, that's what started to develop. So after this snow event, nothing really happened. This melt freeze layer hadn't started to form yet. But by mid-February, we have above 8,000 feet, all three problems that are going to plague last season's snowpack. We have depth thaw, a persistent weak layer at the base of our pack. We have a melt freeze crust from a sand layer forming. And then we have modified behaviors because of the COVID restrictions. All three coming together to make an insidious snowpack and a lot of human avalanche involvements. We go high and dry around mid-February, but look at the bottom here, what I've said here. We have now, by mid-February, two distinct different snowpacks, one below 8,000 feet, one above. And that sand layer below 8,000 feet has come onto a very hard, homogeneous snowpack that's set up Also almost an isothermal snowpack below that sand layer. Whereas above 8,000 feet, there's a lot of cold, soft snow with facets dotted around it underneath that sand layer. So a really messy, complex snowpack above 8,000 feet, but quite simple snowpack below. So it went high and dry. We started going out and we started seeing almost straight away avalanching on this sand layer. Well, that's interesting, but I guess it's just shedding some of this newer snow now that we're getting a lot of heat on there. And this day we were heading in to ski these couloirs, and as you can see, our access path was looking pretty hazardous, and we just bailed on that day. And you can see during this 2-week period of going high and dry, this sand layer is starting to start causing snow to shed, starting to do kind of interesting things to the snowpack. We're getting liquid water forming in it because it's absorbing so much heat. That then in turn is freezing. So we're getting a melt freeze crust forming around this sand layer. It's already started to do some interesting things in the first 2 weeks. So here we are, we go back to our timeline event. Below 8,000 feet, the snowpack has reset, but we have sand on top. But above, we have this really compact snowpack. There's our 10 deaths in 7 days in and around the Verbier area. And we're getting bits and pieces of activity coming through again above 8,000 feet. The snowpack is very benign below 8,000 feet. And after a couple of weeks, storms start coming back in, but nothing unusual where we were. In those lower mountains where we're spending a lot of our time, it was just business as normal. Wind events, snow events, nothing unusual. And we kind of start to forget about that sand layer. It's like, well, it's buried and we'll see what happens with it. But I wasn't really particularly concerned about it. We're just going on with business as usual, just getting out and getting great rewards. Low down, the snow was good. Stability seemed really good. We were getting after it and having some fun. But around that time, around mid-February, they started to loosen up some of the restrictions on travel, and we can go a little further away. And I was really keen to see the snowpack above 8,000 feet, right? All of these involvements on the Swiss side and high up in Chamonix, people were getting caught and carried. It's like, right, let's go and have a look at some of this now that I can move further away. So we traveled to the ski resort of Tignes, still in the northwestern Alps. And this is a much higher resort. Very similar skier profile, but Verbier, where all of these fatalities have been occurring, in that it's a hardcore ski area, lots of pro skiers, strong recreationists, seasonaires, people that go out and ski a season, take a year out. It's a high mountain resort. And unlike some of the terrain, or most of that terrain that we've been skiing sub 8,000, instantly you're into challenging to complex terrain. There's very little simple terrain to choose from, straight into it. Its lowest elevation is 8,700 feet and extends up to 10,500. So straight away, quite a different skier profile and snowpack profile. And it was interesting. We spent just a day there and watched somebody get avalanched. This data code here is the avalanche that we witnessed above us. Soft slab, artificial skier unintentionally triggered, a small pocket of wind slab that popped out. And yeah, a couple of 20 centimeters overnight, and instantly we're starting to see much bigger kind of terrain and the avalanches coming from that, and behaviors around that were pretty surprising. This is unmitigated terrain, no ski patrol, and some pretty alarming behaviors, people skiing it. The girl who set this off was skiing by herself, clearly a very good skier, And as she was traversing in, I said to my ski partner, I don't just watch where she's skiing. And sure enough, released above us, we were straight up onto a ridge, didn't quite reach us. And I just went up and had a chat with her, and she was French. She was like, but it's just a small slab. And I was like, well, I'm kind of like glad. I don't really want to be with you when you sort of a big slab. Yeah, interesting kind of behaviors going on around there in and around Teen. And there was another 50 centimeters forecast to come in that night and stormy, and really sort of had a good dig about and found some of those lower basal facets. And we were like, you know what? I'm kind of happy going back down to 8,000 feet and skiing below that. There's another image of it there. So you can see all the skier tracks there. And she's just pulled out this pocket. These are pretty old ski tracks. She's traversed out here to get some clean snow above us and then popped out this slab. It's chased her down. She's kind of skied off out to the side of it. Yeah, so we kind of went, we kind of had a sniff around in that high elevation, and there was nothing there that really was appealing to us. We were quite happy to stay below 8,000 feet, really, for the rest of the winter after that. Big storms rolling in, getting good rewards, great ski rewards below 8,000 feet. No problem at all. Low down, we've got the advantage of trees for contrast, so storm skiing was really good. The Gucci handbag set wasn't coming out on storm days. We're getting great rewards. No need to go high. Bear in mind, travel restrictions had eased by then. You could move around further afield, but people were still pushing up into the higher terrain instead of going for that lower elevation terrain. We were getting good results. We were getting good skiing, good rewards, low down, and we were just quite happily lapping away that for the rest of the winter. And then as spring starts to develop, our latitude here is pretty low down. It's kind of similar to Utah. So, you know, by middle of late March, we're in full spring conditions here. Yet still in above 8,000 feet in that Verbier area, multiple avalanche deaths occurring, people just constantly going out and pushing into that horrible snowpack. Lift access above 8,000 feet. And now that sand layer for sure has set up as a melt freeze crust. And the Swiss forecast is definitely saying they're talking about wind slab coming in, they're talking about the basal faceting, but they're not talking about that sand layer. And that's kind of interesting. This was a post that I put out there in our social media because we were digging around and finding facets growing underneath that melt freeze sand crust and getting quite reactive results from it. And again, in the profile, this is the melt freeze cross from the sand layer with facets below it. This other profile again is the sand layer, facets below it. And even below 8,000 feet, the red line here is the sand layer, and we have facets above it. Look at these tests here. We're getting compression test 18 with planar results, resistant planar results on the 21st tap. Not getting propagation on extended column test, but getting a vertical collapse in and around that melt freeze crust from the sand layer. And below 8,000 feet, that sand layer is on a very hard, homogeneous snowpack. So have a look at that, see what that actually looks like now in the pack. multiple melt freeze crusts, and then large facets growing underneath that crust on top of that sand layer. You can see how conspicuous it is. Very easy to find in the snowpack. You can actually see the crystalline faceted forms just on top of that sand layer there, with a crust just above it that they're growing underneath. Video doesn't play very well on Zoom. Let's see if this works. I don't know if you'll be able to see this or not, but it's kind of...
You can see where it has partially collapsed. It is on this sand layer, and the problem is just above that sand layer, we've got these loose facets you can see popping out here. So hard to initiate. Some places we're getting propagation, other places were not, so mixed results. It's a bit of a mixed bag, and this is what this harder snow above, this storm layer here, and then a bit of older snow, and then a melt freeze crust, and under that melt freeze crust we've got about a 5 centimeter layer of facets, pretty small facets.
I don't know if you could see it. I don't know how well that played, but you could see that those facets and how loose and granular and sugar-like they were on top, directly on top of that sand layer. And then we got caught by it right at the end of March, so full spring diurnal conditions, and we went off to ski a southwest aspect below 8,000 feet, and in the afternoon, and we kind of went a little too late in the day, really. Friends had skied this line the day before, said they got really good spring corn conditions. We had a leisurely start, and we're going to ski this slope here. And you can see our friends' tracks from the day before. Second skier on a little steep rollover initiated a soft slab avalanche. We were kind of expecting wet loose because we were so late in the afternoon, and we were thinking, well, that's a very manageable problem. We'll work terrain, we'll ski one at a time. We'll be mindful of being sloughed by wet loose coming in behind us. But second skier down, popped off, size 1.5 avalanche there. And you can see from this photograph, we're on this sand layer. It's initiated and gone on those facets on that sand layer. You can see that the slab above the sand layer is performing like spring snow. It's nice snow, but just further down in the pack, a couple of feet down, you can see the extent of the crown wall here, a couple of feet. There's that sand layer, and it's a really cohesive slab that's formed on top of it. It's another aspect from it there. You can see the color of the sand in the snow. So how to mitigate against that? We figured that we'd probably be able to manage it by going earlier in the day and just getting the soft snow on top of it, but we were certainly spooked by that. The skier was absolutely fine. He got carried on his backside for about a couple of 100 feet and popped up and managed to get back on his skis and skied off to the side. He wasn't buried at all. So our management strategy for that kind of meant we were getting up really early in the mornings, kind of breaking curfew by an hour or so, and trying to get to that trailhead super early so we could hit our descent just as the top layer was just turning soft, hopefully not having any water percolating down to that sand layer interface, and just keeping our elevation below 8,000 feet again. We're creeping into bigger terrain, but just mindful now of that sand layer and what it's doing underneath us. We were not wanting to be on these slopes with any chance of any liquid water percolating down to that sand layer. and we're looking as much as we could for sub 30-degree slopes as well. Certainly slopes with cleaner runouts. This was probably the biggest, most consequential run we did all season. And yeah, right in the back of my mind, I'm definitely thinking about that sand layer. We're 4 hours earlier in the day here. This is just after 10 o'clock and the snow's just turning. And yeah, that sand layer's got me pretty freaked, I have to say. So here we are now, coming to the end of the season. And yeah, now check all of this out here. So we're coming up to another major cycle, and look how this coincides with a cold storm and the end of restrictions in France, and they opened the cable car up to 11,500 feet in Chamonix. So yeah, strong winds at elevation leading to unusual loading patterns, and which is always a concern, right? Because anything anomalous is, for me, is definitely a kind of a red flag. We don't like anomalies, and for sure that sand layer is up there as well. That's anomalous. We're twitchy about that. Now we've got a big May spring storm with very strong winds, and those basal facets have persisted all winter long. So now you're opening the first lift of the season, right at the end of the season, after this big storm. And a large avalanche cycle has gone off. Classic ski runs that are normally skier compacted are avalanching. Again, guides are being involved. 2 guides died on that day in 2 separate incidents. One a mountain, both mountaineers. Neither of whom were skiing. They're out on mountaineering trips. Hard to get the scale from these photographs. These are all both these photographs are size 3. Right? It's a size 3 avalanches. Large destructive avalanches stepping down onto those basal facets. Yeah, and interestingly, well, everybody was desperate to head up those high altitude open lifts. Conditions low down were really, really good. Yes, that sand layer melt freeze cross is a concern, but there's no lack of cover. We're moving to cold snow on the north, nice spring snow on the south, and empty mountains. There was no shortage of good quality ski rewards below that 8,000 feet threshold. No shortage of them at all. And that's how we finished our season off. We didn't go high. The only time I went high all of last season was that trip to Teen, and that was enough, really. I saw enough from just that one day above 8,000 feet to say that I should keep below 8,000 feet, and so did all the people I skied with. There was no lack of rewards at below 8,000 feet. We just saw out our season. And this kind of photograph concludes the season, really. So this looks like a quaint mountain hut, but this is actually what would normally be the last day of the season. And this is a bar that normally has people dancing on tables and drinking champagne out of the bottle on the last day of the season. And you can see the big PA system there that's usually boom, bop, boom, bop, boom, bop, across the mountain as the resorts in the afternoon and the resorts there. And here we are on this May day with the only 2 people on the entire mountain skiing really nice spring corn. And that's how we saw our season out, a very unusual season. Yeah. Thanks for listening, and yeah, open for any questions. I think there's some interesting correlations here between maybe what went over here in Europe and the season you guys had over on the East Coast there.
Really, really great presentation, Mike. Thank you. I think Blake probably can wrangle a couple of questions for us.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. I really, so we got a question here from Kyle, and really specific. It's a good one. Starts off, hey Mike, great talk. As someone who lived in Switzerland the past 4 years, this past year was certainly different and more challenging than others in the past. After seeing the sand layer well into the spring, I started to wonder if the sand was causing an air-snow interface due to the granulation of the difference in grain properties of the sand compared to snow crystals. Do you think this could be a cause for the unstable conditions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I said there in the lecture, when it first came down, I kind of dismissed it very quickly because I just figured, well, you've got that albedo effect. It's going to soak up a lot of heat, but it got covered really quickly. And it was only later in retrospect when I started reading some of the scientific papers on what it does. And there isn't even many of those. There's just 2 of those. The main problem is that the commonality of both of these papers is it changes the temperature profile around that sand layer. It's not necessarily the sand layer itself. The sand layer does suck a lot of heat, and it is doing something we don't really understand while it stays in the snowpack, because it continues to do it once it's buried. But the bottom line is that doesn't matter. As practitioners, all we need to be mindful of is that is setting up a crust, a melt-freeze crust within that snowpack. And we know with all melt-freeze crusts, we think back to what Don Sheriff was talking about yesterday, they are all, melt-freeze crusts are a problem in our snowpack. They will grow facets underneath them because they're a barrier to that vapor transport outright. Because of that temperature gradient, they'll not only grow facets beneath them, they'll grow facets above them. And certainly where we were in France, you saw those. But did the video play? Did that actually work? I don't know if that could you see the video? Yeah, so you could see there was like a multiple sandwich. It was of cross, and then you had all those facets there. So ultimately, you can overthink that sand layer, but it's creating faceting in the snowpack, and you're getting a hardness layer because the facets are really, really soft. The big crystals. Think about all of those yellow flags and yellow lemons. They're against a hard, icy layer. You've got a great interface for an avalanche to occur.
Awesome. Thank you. Pat, do we have time for one more, or?
You're muted there, Pat.
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Okay. Yeah, let's do one more. And Mike, if you are able to stick around, and there's a couple questions that are in the Q&A that maybe you could answer about weather resources for looking at weather data in Europe. I know that's a little bit different than it is in the US. So those might be good questions for there. Let's do one more. And by the way, I was muted, but really, really great presentation, Mike. Thank you.
I think it went a little long. I'm kind of sorry about that.
Sorry.
No,
all right,
it's
here
all
we
good.
go. Last question. In your area, you have 3 countries in the same mountain range. How are rescues organized, and are there ever conflicts over who executes it?
No. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, I do a lot of skiing in North America. I spent about half my season in North America and the other half here in Europe. And part of the problem that we have here, and part of these behaviors that you're seeing from the skiers here, is that the rescue services are outstanding. They're ridiculously good. They're extremely well resourced. It's all helicopter. It's virtually all helicopter based, but super slick, super coordinated. Generally, so I refer to the PGHM, which is the Patrol the Mountain. The mountain. It's the gendarmerie, the mountain gendarmerie. They're a quasi-military organization, and yeah, it's full-on military grade rescue. They coordinate extremely well between the 2 of them. They'll actually go over borders to assist each other. In the summertime, they're just flying around constantly, and there's multiple birds in the air rescuing people. They'll rescue 4 or 5 people a day up and around the Mont Blanc region, no problem at all. Sometimes more on a nice sunny Saturday in July. 10, 12 rescues from alpinists is not unusual. It's on a completely different scale to North America. The Swiss are extremely good. The Italians are extremely good, and the French are extremely good. I'm not particularly a Europhile, but they have it completely dialed over here. The guides all have direct line phone numbers to those helicopter services. There's generally cell reception all over these mountains. All guides carry secondary comms around here as well. So if you fire up an inReach, you will have a resource to you. Generally, if the weather's good, the birds are flying and they'll be with you in under 10, 15 minutes. That's the kind of response time you're looking at.
Awesome. Again, Mike, really great and timely presentation. I really appreciated your approach to that topic. I think it's honestly one of my favorites at any ESA. So I enjoyed that a lot. But so we do want to keep this moving. So like I said, Mike, if you're able to answer some of those, there might be a couple more questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And they might be good to just maybe type out an answer to for somebody, if you don't mind doing that.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll jump on that.
Awesome. And I'm gonna do a quick raffle right now. And then if Frank, if you're listening, if you can just, when I'm done, you can get ready and introduce Pascal for us. And so intermission raffle here. Again, if you're joining us last night, Hillary McCloy, Physical Therapy and Coaching, is a sponsor of ESA this year. And like I said last night, she's helped me personally with a couple injuries and a surgery. Super knowledgeable, former US ski team member. And if you're interested in physical therapy from somebody who's going to teach you about the process so that you can further, your own wellness, she's an amazing person to learn from. And so she's donated a Power Hour subscription for this winter. So it's a weekly ski training, preseason training program. And that winner tonight is James Marculela. And I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, but James, we've got your email and we'll reach out to you about that. Congratulations. And thank you, Hillary. And then so without further ado, Frank, feel free to introduce Pascal, and Pascal, feel free to start to get your presentation loaded up here, and we'll get going.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Mike. Great presentation. Our next speaker this year, Pascal Haegeli, has contributed so much to avalanche forecasting over the years, to the work that he does at Simon Fraser University. The mix of social sciences and the research on how people use forecasts has just been really helpful to all of us in the avalanche forecasting world. And I think you'll agree that he's more than just a simple snow doctor. So Pascal, take it away.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. It's really a great pleasure to be at ESA this year and to get the opportunity to talk a little bit about our research. This presentation is going to be quite a bit different because it's research focused, and it's going to introduce you to sort of our perspective or how we're trying to contribute to have avalanche forecasts work better and basically resonate better with the needs of the very diverse recreational audience that we're trying to serve. I'm coming to you from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. I have a team of about 8 grad students working with me currently, and we cover a wide variety of different topics, going from snowpack modeling all the way to risk communication. And actually sort of the 4 co-authors you see here on the opening slide of my presentation are 4 of my grad students. We have Anne Sinclair, a former master's student of mine, and now she came back to do a PhD. Henry Finn and Katie Fisher, 2 recent master's graduates, and then Abby Morgan is currently a student with me. So in this presentation, I'm going to share some of our latest results from our risk communication research, where we're trying to provide a social science perspectives on how to make avalanche forecasts communicate better. Now, let's see, here we go. Now, before I talk about the research, I just want to briefly acknowledge that Simon Fraser University and my research program are situated on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Tsleil-Waututh, the Coquitlam, the Squamish, and the Musqueam nations. The image you see on the right of this slide shows the welcome pole, which greets everybody who comes to SFU through its main entrance. We're very grateful for being able to work on these territories, and the land acknowledgements at the beginning of our presentations are part of our small contribution to truth and reconciliation. Now, to help recreationalists make informed travel decisions, the Avalanche Bulletin needs to master 2 communication transactions. First, forecasters need to convert the available information about the current conditions into an accurate conditions report. And second, recreationalists need to be able to take this report and turn it into a meaningful decision about when and where to go into the backcountry. Over the last few years, there have been several studies that have examined the forecasting process, but targeted research focusing on how end users interpret bulletin information is much more sparse. And so the objective of our research program is to contribute to this area by providing sort of tangible answers to the following questions. How do recreationalists use, understand, and apply bulletin information? Does the provided information match with users' needs and expectations? And what are common hurdles or challenges? And our goal is to produce results that highlight opportunities and offer actionable insight for improving the effectiveness of Avalanche bulletins. Our research program in this area is organized in 3 main phases. We started with qualitative interviews to get a first overview of how people use Avalanche bulletins. We then conducted a large-scale online survey to examine the observed patterns in a larger sample. And in phase 3, we started to explore possibilities for making Avalanche bulletins more effective. Now, in this presentation, I'll briefly touch on the results of 4 specific analyses that we've been working on over the last 2 years, and this is where the 4 different student co-authors come into play. So let's start with Anne Sinclair's qualitative study on bulletin user types. So to get started on this topic, Anne and Henry together conducted 48 semi-structured interviews that included several practical exercises to stimulate a conversation around bulletin use. We put considerable effort into making sure that we had a diverse range of interviewees that included recreationalists who barely knew that the bulletin existed to keeners who read it like the newspaper every day. After transcribing all the interviews, Anne used a method called thematic analysis to identify patterns in a systematic way. And here is what her analysis revealed. So she found 5 distinct bulletin use patterns that can be organized in somewhat of a hierarchy. So very briefly, the 5 levels include type A's, who simply don't use the bulletin for a variety of different reasons. Type B's, who decide whether to go into the backcountry or not, simply based on the danger rating alone. Type C's, who also focus on the danger rating, but combine it with their knowledge of the terrain to make an informed choice about where to go. Then we have type D's, who are the first to integrate avalanche problems, but still rely on the bulletin as their main information source. And then we have type E's, who use the bulletin information as a starting point, but validate and localize the assessment with their own observations once they're out in the field. So Anne's work provides several important take-home messages. First, it's important to realize that depending on your context, each of these use patterns is a completely valid approach for managing avalanche risk. For example, if you're a snowshoer only staying on marked trails, just using the danger rating is probably an appropriate way to manage the risk. That's very different from somebody who's really keen to ski a very advanced line. The typology also points out that what components of the bulletin are most relevant for the different users and how they use them. This highlights that the different bulletin components really need to be designed with users in mind. So the danger rating really needs to work for the B's and C's who rely on it the most, while we can use other bulletin parts to communicate with the D's and E's. Last but not least, Anne found a really interesting link to an existing taxonomy in the education literature that offers valuable insight about how to facilitate the progression towards processing more information. So how can we move people from one step in that typology to the next one? I think Anne's typology is an important first step to better understand our users and how to better match our bulletin products to their needs and practices. Now, the obvious next question is whether recreationalists who say they use the bulletin in a specific way actually have the skills they need to use it effectively at that level. To answer this question, Henry Finn conducted an extensive online survey in the spring of 2019. Early on in the survey, we included a series of statements that allowed participants to self-identify their bulletin user type. You see that on the left-hand side of the slide. You can see those different statements. We then followed up with basic recall questions and more advanced comprehension questions to test participants' understanding of the bulletin parts at the different levels. The core of the survey was an application question where participants were given a complete bulletin, an idealized mountainscape where they had to assess which slopes were accessible for travel under the given condition. You see that on the very bottom right of the slide. Henry then derived a bulletin user type specific grading for assessing participants' performance on these questions. So this means that we expected D's to use more advanced information and make assessments at a higher level than C's and B's. Now, what did Henry find? In general, the performance on the recall and the comprehension questions were quite high. but more than half of the participants failed to give a reasonable response in the slope choice question at their level. So this really highlights that while participants knew what the individual concepts meant, putting them together into a meaningful decision was much more challenging. Henry also looked at how participants' backgrounds related to their performance. We don't really have time to get into the details here, but some of the most insightful results were that while formal avalanche training had a positive effect, as expected, years of backcountry experience did not. So it wasn't that people who spent more time in the backcountry or more years in the backcountry performed better on these exercises, which was a little bit surprising initially. So Henry's results offer some very tangible insights about where different bulletin user types might be challenged and what user segments could be worthwhile targets for new awareness campaigns. Now, the objective of Abby Morgan's project is to learn as much as possible about how recreationalists perceive and use the danger scale based on additional questions we had in our survey. So let's quickly look at some of the key results from her study. Now, by design, the danger scale is not a linear, but it's an exponential scale, similar to the scales used for other natural hazards like earthquakes or hurricanes. The chart you see on the right was recently published by Jörg Schweitzers and colleagues, and it shows the amount of avalanche activity in a small but well-monitored forecast region as a function of the local danger rating. The numbers at the top indicate how many forecast days are included in the box plots for each level, which nicely show the nonlinear increase. As we go up on the scale, the difference between the different levels increases. Several other studies have shown similar trends, and Bruce Tremper talks about this aspect of the danger scale in his book. Now, having an accurate understanding of the nature of the avalanche danger scale seems critical for making informed choices about backcountry travel. We were therefore curious to learn more about how recreationalists actually perceive that scale. So to examine participants' perception of the danger scale, our 2019 survey included a question with sliders that allowed participants to indicate what range of severity they associate with the different levels. 0 on the left-hand side represented no avalanche hazard at all, and 100% on the other side of the scale represented widespread large natural avalanches reaching valley bottoms. So each participant, as you can see in this little animation, basically gave us 5 ranges with an upper and lower bound. So basically 10 data points in total. Now for the analysis, let's rotate the sliders by 90 degrees so that our chart has the same orientation as the figure from Jörg Schweitzer. As an example of a possible answer, the pattern you see on the chart right now represents the evenly spaced ranges with no overlap. Overall, we had about 2,700 participants provide us with their assessments. And what you see on the chart now is the distribution of the ranges from the entire data set. To analyze this data, we used a so-called latent class linear mixed effects model. The details don't really matter here, but it basically allowed us to fit a line through these data points to extract how people perceive the danger scale. And we set it up in a way that we were able to see whether this line is curved or not. A really cool thing about this analysis method is that they can group participants according to the similarity of that regression line. So this basically allows us to identify distinct clusters of participants who perceive the danger scale in a particular way. What you see on this slide are the 7 distinct patterns in avalanche danger scale perception that Abby and I identified in our analysis. Each pattern is characterized by the typical ranges for each danger rating level and the regression line that goes through the center point of each range. We don't have enough time to go into the details of each pattern, but let me just highlight the big picture. So roughly half of the participants viewed the danger scale linear scale with evenly spaced non-overlapping ranges. Another 25% of the sample also views the danger scale as mainly linear, but the ranges are wider and overlapping. In pattern 4, the one on the left, the range of considerable is substantially wider than the other ranges. While another 20% or so of the sample perceives the scale to have a convex shape, with the distance between levels decreasing as we go up, it was only about 6% of the sample who drew a convex shape similar to what we saw in Jörg Schweitzer's chart. To better understand what drives these perceptions, we examined the characteristics of the participants who ended up in these different groups. Turns out that days of backcountry travel per year, we interpret as kind of an engagement in backcountry activities, is the most important driving factor here. Participants who spend more than 50 days in the backcountry each winter have a significantly lower proportion of the basic linear pattern and a higher proportion of the linear pattern with the wider range at considerable. Avalanche awareness training was less important, but it has a similar effect. So it moved people in the same direction. The last factor that emerged as being significant was experience. With more experienced folks having higher proportions of people who perceive the danger scale as having a convex shape. Interestingly, the people who correctly drew the danger scale as concave did not exhibit any specific user profile. So they weren't more trained or more engaged or more experienced or anything else. They were a rather random group of people. Now, perception is one thing, but even more important is how recreationalists integrate the danger rating into their trip planning process. And to examine this question, we straight up asked participants how they use each danger rating level. And we gave them 4 different response options. At this danger rating level, I primarily go based on the danger rating. I go mainly based on the danger rating, but also check other information. At this level, avalanche problems and forecast details are the basis of my decision to go. And at this level, the danger rating alone prevents me from going into the backcountry. So we were really targeting the trip planning process with this question. In total, we had about 2,500 participants complete this question. And the stacked bar chart that you see on the left here on this slide provides an overview of the patterns in the complete sample. Some of the key observations here include that 91% of participants stay at home at extreme. That's the very bar on the very right. 62%, so almost 2/3 of participants stay at home at extreme and high based on the danger rating alone. At the other end of the spectrum, 32% go into the backcountry at low, primarily based on the danger rating, and 5% do the same thing at low and moderate. Similar to the analysis of the danger scale perception question, we were also curious about whether there's distinct patterns in how people responded to these 5 questions. And our analysis kind of clustered the response into 5 distinct groups. The first 2 patterns, which represent about 60% of our sample, stay at home during high and extreme. The left group relies a little bit more on the danger rating than the group on the right, which you can see by sort of the green being a little bit more dominant on the left. The pattern in the bottom row are similar to the patterns in the top row, with the exception that these folks rely on other bulletin information to make the decision whether to go out or not under high. The 5th pattern in the top right is a bit of a special case where people primarily rely on the danger rating under both low and moderate. Similar to the danger rating perception analysis, it is primarily days of backcountry travel per year that determined which of these patterns participants belong to. So participants who go out less than 10 days a winter were more prevalent in the first 2 patterns, where participants don't go out under high, and people who go out for 20 days or more were more prevalent in pattern 5. Again, avalanche awareness training only played a secondary role, with more highly trained folks being more prevalent in the patterns in the bottom row. Interestingly, the danger rating perception itself, so how people view the shape of that scale, didn't really matter in how people use the danger scale information. So to wrap up this part of my presentation, here are some of the key take-home messages that I take from this analysis. We saw that most people perceive the danger scale to be linear, which is different from how avalanche researchers look at it. Interestingly, avalanche awareness training did not make a difference in how people look at the scale. We also saw that about 2/3 of participants simply stay home when the danger rating is high or extreme. So they don't distinguish between these 2 levels. What is interesting here is that how people perceive the scale did not seem to affect how they use it to make basic trip planning decisions. Now, what are we going to do with this information? Our next step is really to work with avalanche centers and educators to figure out what exactly these results mean for us. For me, the big question is, does the danger scale do the best possible job communicating the conditions to the users who rely on the danger scale the most? So now that we've identified that applying the information of the avalanche forecast is a key challenge among many avalanche forecast users, we shifted gear a bit and started to think about how we could make it easier for them. And this is where Katie's research is coming in. So in the late winter of 2020, right about when we got shut down by COVID the first time, we conducted another large-scale survey where we examined how slight modifications to the avalanche forecast information and presentation might make it easier for recreationalists to understand it. More specifically, we were interested to better understand how the presentation of the aspect and elevation information of avalanche problems could be improved, how adding a learning intervention could enhance people's understanding, and how the travel and terrain advice statements could be improved. So for the rest of the presentation, I will provide you with a detailed description of the results of the first two aspects of Katie's research here. To examine the question of the location information presentation, we gave our survey participants an avalanche forecast scenario with two avalanche problems and asked them to rank the provided routes according to their exposure to the problems. We presented the location information in three different ways. In the Canadian style, with elevation and aspect information in separate graphics. In the US style, with each avalanche problem presented in a separate aspect elevation rows. And in a new style, where all the information was combined into a single graphic. Participants were randomly assigned to one of these three presentation formats. And each of them completed 4 ranking tasks with different routes and avalanche conditions. And after they completed these rankings, we also asked participants about their personal preference for these different presentation formats. So in total, for that survey, we had slightly over 3,000 people participating, completing roughly 12,000 ranking tasks. So it was a super rich data set and really exciting for analyzing. We then used a number of regression analyses to isolate the effect of that presentation format on the correctness of participants' route ranking, how long it took them to complete that task, and how much they liked the presentation format. So how did this work out? To make this results tangible, I'm presenting the calculated performances based on the regression parameters for the different graphics, holding everything else constant. So when you look at these numbers that I'm going to show you in a second, focus primarily on the differences and not necessarily the absolute values. So let's look at the chance of completing the ranking task correctly first. Everything else being the same, the chance of completing the task correctly was roughly 8 percentage points higher for participants who were presented with the American graphic. There was no significant difference between the Canadian and the new graphic. So we have a clear winner in this category. With respect to completion time, participants presented with the American and the new graphic were roughly 10 seconds faster than if they were presented with the Canadian graphic. We take this result to mean that combining the elevation and aspect information takes considerable mental effort, whereas combining the information of the two problems together is much easier. So here we have 2 winners, and the Canadian graphic is a distant third. In our analysis of the preference rating, we found several interactions, which means how much people like a graphic depends on the interplay with other variables. For example, Americans really liked their own graphic, whereas Canadians liked their graphic equally well as the American, but overall at a lower level. Which graphic participants used during the route ranking exercise also mattered. Overall, participants liked the American graphic the best, but the difference was smaller among participants who used the other graphics for the exercise. And finally, we found an interesting pattern with Avalanche training. Again, the American icon was consistently rated the highest at all training levels, but the preference for the new graphic was dependent on participants' training level. Participants with less training liked it more, and participants with professional level training liked it considerably less. So overall, here again, the American graphic is clearly the most preferred. So let's briefly summarize these results. The American graphic is the clear winner as it outperformed the other graphics in all aspects. The race for second was tight, but the new graphic prevailed because of the faster completion times, which we interpreted as it being easier to process. Another important result of our analysis is that people generally like what they're used to. So if an Avalanche center is planning to change their information presentation in their forecast, they should be ready for some resistance, at least initially. So these results probably mean that we have a little bit of work to do in Canada, but more generally, it highlights that design really matters and it's not just about content. And I think that this type of research can really help to make our products easier to understand and help people make better decisions. Now, for the last study that I want to present, let's go back to one of the main results of Henry's survey. So he showed that while participants performed well on the knowledge questions, they had challenges when they had to combine this information into an assessment. We also know that it is quite difficult for people to develop their assessment skills in the field because the backcountry environment does not always provide meaningful feedback. This is because we're dealing with a so-called wicked learning environment, where it is possible to get away with bad decisions for a long time. So people need help with putting these pieces together, and they need feedback. But most recreationalists only take 1 or 2, if any, Avalanche courses in their backcountry career. And this means that we only have limited opportunities for guiding them. And this made us think whether Avalanche forecasts could actually play an important active role in this. So instead of just being a conditions report, could we add an interactive activity that could help forecast users better understand the information that's presented? So the second objective of Katie's survey was to explore this idea. As mentioned before, in Katie's survey, everybody completed 2 route ranking exercises with 2 different Avalanche forecasts. So everybody did 4 in total. Now, between the 2 sets, we added a learning intervention in the middle to see how we could boost the performance of our participants. There were 3 types of learning interventions. The first one was a reflection exercise, where participants simply had to describe how they assessed the routes and decided on the rankings. There's considerable evidence in the education literature that these types of exercises help people to think through problems and solidify their knowledge. Participants who got the second learning intervention were simply provided with the solutions to the ranking. And the last learning intervention did not only provide users with the answers, but also explained how we came up with these ratings in detail. So you see the little map on the right with the description above. Now, how did these interventions affect participants' ability to rank the routes correctly? What you see on this chart is participants' probability of ranking the routes correctly prior to the learning intervention. As you can see, there was no significant difference between the different groups initially, which is what you would be hoping for. On this chart, we compare the average performance before and after the learning intervention for each of the interventions. Turns out that when looking at all participants together, the impact of these interventions was minimal, and they didn't help participants to do the ranking task better in the second half of the experiment. So this was a rather disappointing and somewhat perplexing result at the time. And we really sort of made us scratch our head. To better understand what's actually going on, we split the participants of each intervention into thirds, depending on how much time they spent on that intervention page. So how much time they spent with that learning task. LO or low represents people who spend less than the average amount of time on the page. ME or medium represents people who spend about the average amount of time on the page. And HI or high represents participants who spend more than the average time on the page. The chart on the bottom right shows you how this worked out for the learning intervention with answers. So we consider participants who spend less than 17 seconds on that page to have low engagement. 17 to 29 seconds represented a medium engagement. And we rated people who spent more than 30 seconds on this page as being highly engaged. Because the interaction with the different intervention types required different amount of time, like people who had to read more obviously had to spend more time on this page, these thresholds were different for the different types. So let's look at the performance prior to the engagement again. Turns out that there is a strong relationship between participants' performance prior to the intervention and their engagement in the intervention. If you look on the left-hand side, there is a slight positive relationship for the reflection exercise. This is making sense because the more you know, the more time you will need to describe it in that text box. So that's why people who perform better would have spent more time on that intervention page. On the other hand, we observed significantly negative relationships for the other two intervention types. This also makes sense because you would think that people who did not do well in the first set would want to figure it out how this works when we gave them the solutions and when we explained how we came up with these rankings. Now, how did the interventions affect people's performance in the different engagement groups? The reflection exercise still had no effect. Basically, it didn't make any difference. The answers resulted in a significant boost among the highly engaged, and the explanations resulted in a significant boost among the highly and medium engaged. Overall, the explanations resulted in the highest overall performance. But there's something else interesting here that I would like to point out. Among the least engaged participants, the interventions actually led to a drop in their performance. This seems a little bit odd initially, but the explanation that we came up with is that people who accidentally got the rankings correct in the first round might have gotten a false sense of confidence by getting a thumbs up in the feedback. And then because they sort of accidentally got it right in the first place, they also accidentally screwed it up in the second set. So I think that's where that is coming from. So overall, the interventions mostly worked, and they primarily helped participants who needed the help the most. So the people who really didn't do well in that first round. Now, after the experiment, we asked all participants how useful they found the learning intervention, and we related that back to the performance in the exercise, their backgrounds, and demographics, using a statistical method called conditional inference trees. As expected, the intervention with the explanation was liked the most, and more engaged participants also found the learning intervention to be more useful. The only background variable that emerged as significant was the number of days spent in the backcountry every year. Among participants who received the explanation, people who spent 10 or fewer days in the backcountry each year found the learning intervention more useful than people who spend more time in the backcountry. I think that makes a lot of sense. When we ask participants about the usefulness of the route ranking exercise overall, 88% found it very useful or fairly useful overall. Again, participants who spend less time in the country found it more useful. But this time, avalanche awareness training also emerged as a significant predictor. Not overly surprising, participants with professional level training found the exercise less useful than participants with no or basic recreational level training. That also makes a lot of sense. As before, participants who were more engaged also found the exercise more useful. Now, what are the big take-home messages from this part of Katie's study? Since the avalanche environment makes it difficult for people to develop their assessment skills through experiential learning alone in the field, recreationalists seem to be hungry for these learning opportunities. Avalanche forecasts are in a unique position to provide these opportunities because recreationalists, even the ones without formal training, regularly interact with them. And so our research showed that well-designed interactive exercises can help recreationalists to get better at interpreting the available information. So I think there is really potential for some very exciting opportunities here. So I hope this whirlwind presentation gave you a meaningful overview of some of our recent research efforts. I also hope that my presentation was able to highlight how we can combine qualitative and quantitative social sciences with established theories to contribute to avalanche safety in a very tangible way by establishing relevant frameworks, identifying existing challenges, and then explicitly testing how we can improve these performances. Now, to finish up, I just want to sort of share a few overarching take-home messages that I think have emerged from our research. It is well known in the risk communication community that having a good understanding of the target audience is really critical for designing effective communication tools. And in addition, good risk communication always needs to be a two-way street. While we have something to share with recreationalists, we should also do our best to learn from recreationalists about what works for them and what doesn't. So our challenge is that our target audience is quite diverse, and there is a wide range of bulletin use practices out there that use different parts of the bulletin in different ways. And now it's important that the design of these different parts really targets the users who need those parts the most. In other words, the danger rating needs to work for Bs and Cs who rely on that information for their decision-making process, while other types of information in the bulletin can be targeted to other level users. Another point I would like to make is that combining the available information into meaningful decisions is a really challenging task that requires practice and feedback. But getting this feedback is really difficult for us because of that wicked learning environment that I mentioned before. So the comments we get in our survey really highlight that participants really like these exercises and they're hungry for these opportunities to get feedback. And as I said before, I think the bulletin could potentially play a critical role here because recreationalists interact with the bulletin on a fairly regular basis. So if we can include some of these interactive exercises directly in the bulletin, we could move the bulletin away from just a pure conditions report to a key part of the education system. Last but not least, I think social science can really help to make this happen, but it has to be systematic, grounded in established theories, but also applied to focus on kind of practical and actionable insight that we can then use to make the bulletin better. To finish, we would like to thank everybody who participated in our research. It wouldn't be possible to do it without you. And if there's some time left, I'm happy to take some questions. So thanks everybody for listening, and have a great start to the winter.
Pascal, thank you. I took a lot away from this, and I actually can remember taking a couple of these surveys myself. So it was really great to see this research tied back, because I honestly, I had forgotten about it until you pulled the slide up and I said, oh, wow, I remember this from a year or two ago. So that was really great. And it's exciting to think about the future in terms of the innovation of how the forecast can be used as more of a educational tool. And I think there's a lot of room for growth and innovation there. So that's exciting to think about for the next few years. It looks like we have some really great questions from the audience. So I'll let Blake handle a couple of those. And Frank, it looks like you have your hand up. So go ahead first. Oh, hold on, Frank, you're muted. Let me just make sure you can. Oh.
Pascal, that was great. As usual, I just wondered if you could take a moment to describe how you all arrived at the design for the novel aspect and elevation rows, and I'm wondering if there's some learnings there for folks designing similar products to work as memory tools. How, like, what disciplines go into that?
Yeah, so we have here at Simon Fraser University, we have the Vancouver Institute for Visual Analytics. So they're basically specialists in data visualizations. And so we had just basically this brainstorming session with them to come up with this new design. And the idea was very simple. It was basically like, how can we better show how avalanche problems combine and sort of highlight the aspect where you can thread the needle through. But in the end, it turned out that that was actually more difficult for people to interpret. And we sort of explained that we've been trained to think about problems separately. And so it's easier to sort of take in that visual separately and then combine them than if they're all plastered on top of each other and they're different colors. And so it was kind of, I think that American graphic hits that nice sweet spot between being clear and comprehensive at the same time. But it's been fascinating to work together with these designers to see what has to go into a decision or into a design like this. And there's always lots to learn.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. It's an interesting marriage of disciplines. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Pascal. We have a couple questions here. Are you able to take into account individual differences in risk aversion or risk-seeking tendencies, i.e. through separate non-avalanche related assessment of risk-taking? Curious to know if that influences someone's perception of the danger scale independent of their experience and or training.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's actually something that almost bit us a little bit in the ass in that first survey. Because there we asked in that slope task, we asked people which slopes they thought were reasonable for travel. And that clearly relates to or is dependent on people's risk propensity. And it made the analysis quite difficult. We were still able to get something out of it, but it made it quite difficult. In the second survey, that was exactly the reason why we asked people simply to rank the routes, because then the personal risk propensity doesn't matter. Because we weren't asking people about their personal comfort for going into these slopes or not. We were simply asked them about their assessment skills. So we were able to sort of eliminate that from that particular task. But that's definitely a challenge to sort of do this properly so that we can analyze these data sets in a meaningful way and isolate the different factors that come into play. We do have kind of motivation questions in these surveys to determine, like, are you a person who is interested in skiing a gnarly line, or are you more somebody who's just out there enjoying nature? Because that would definitely influence people's choices in a very substantial way.
Excellent, thank you. Wow, we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and read as many as I can. Pat, let me know when I'm out of time. Let's see, does the favorability of a graphic translate to an accurate assessment of risk?
Well, I think our goal is to move people towards a more accurate perception of the risk. In this particular exercise, we were primarily concerned about sort of whether people could identify the location of those risks. We specifically didn't include the danger rating in that assessment because it would have complicated things quite a bit by combining all these different things, like is one sector of considerable more or less dangerous than two sectors of moderate? Like, those are kind of personal perception questions. And so we're really trying to sort of address small chunks here, slowly getting to that sort of comprehensive picture. So partially we did, partially we didn't.
All right, thank you. It's an interesting one. There's often conversation about the impacts of or effect on gender and risk assessment and decision making. Did you see any discernible differences between men and women in your study?
Yeah, we had a number of sort of demographic information in our studies, including gender, age, American or Canadian. And gender didn't come out much in our analysis. Interesting was that age came out as a significant parameter, with older folks performing significantly worse than younger folks. And I think that was a very interesting result, and it's kind of in line with the recent study of Eric Peitsch, who showed that the age of avalanche fatalities seems to be increasing in America. And so I think that could actually be an interesting target audience, kind of older folks who came through the education system a while back when the Avalanche Bulletin looked quite different, and maybe don't get out as much anymore, but still think they have it, and sort of giving them a little heads up that they might need to sort of refresh their skills a bit.
Excellent. All right, and do we have time for one more, Pat?
Yeah, let's do a couple more.
Okay. Would you assign any of the resistance to the novel graphic or to a lack of familiarity? Would you expect its ranking to increase once users get used to or train with it?
Yes, I would expect that. And we also saw, like in the survey, that sort of people who used it during the exercise liked it considerably more than people who didn't. But again, because kind of the performance wasn't quite as high as with the American graphic, I would actually say we're doing pretty well with the American graphic. It's just that the Canadians, the Swiss, and the Austrians need to adopt the American graphic.
All right, and this one's actually for the group as a whole, so maybe a good way to kind of wrap things up. But how do you and how do we encourage good decision-making as we head into the season with shutdown fatigue, forgetfulness, and safely getting back after it as kind of the backdrop for the upcoming season?
Well, that's a very big question, and there's lots of people here on the call who will have very good insight into that. I think one interesting thing that I was thinking about during Mike's question was that, like, people just need to stay on their toes. Like winters, we can have very different winters that are very sort of different from our usual winter. And at least here on the West Coast, we had a number of those recently. And people seem to be often in their patterns. They kind of revert to old patterns. I just know it's good to go here. And in these unusual winters, things can just be very different. And so I think for people to keep that in mind is a very good sort of take-home message for going into a new winter.
Well, I'll chime in. I think for our part on this mountain range here, I hope some of the universal, some of these avalanche problems, specifically facets and crusts, I hope folks acknowledge the complexity of those and continue to, think about the uncertainty of the distribution of these through our terrain. And I think that just one great way to improve the quality of your poker hand that you're playing is to use just some of those common travel techniques and not travel alone, and do some of the really simple risk reduction tricks that just really go a long way to improve your outcomes. So that would be my hope going forward, is folks are respectful of just how anyone can be unlucky.
Yeah, it's a really big question. You could spend hours talking about it. I think if I was to boil it down for people, it would be, just slow down and take time to think through everything, your decisions, listen to your gut, and we live in a world that's really fast paced, and we're used to things happening at a quick pace. But in the mountains, I think it's generally safer if we take a step back and think.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is, and I'm borrowing this from Zahan Villamoria. I was listening to an interview he was giving the other day, and he basically posed this framework that we head into the mountains with, and you're either in a very binary, heading into the mountains with a lot of answers or a lot of questions, and the latter tends to produce, as Pat was alluding to, a much more thoughtful, methodical process. I say that as a subjective and non-scientific statement, but I do think that going into the backcountry with questions and hypotheses is probably one of the best things that we can do as we all enter. I mean, the backcountry in and of itself is complex enough on its own, let alone all the other variables we have going on in the world around us. So slow with lots of questions, at least will be my own mode of operation, especially early season.
All right, anything else, Frank or Blake? Any other points or thoughts or questions?
Well, I'll go ahead and pose this one. We've got a few minutes. Pascal, just personal opinions about the usefulness of the extreme danger rating.
Well, personally, I think it's a very rarely used danger rating. Recent studies from Europe showed that often forecasters actually don't get the extreme rating correct, sort of when you validate afterwards. And then based on our study, like basically 60% of our sample treats high and extreme the same. And so then is it really useful to have that level is a good question. Like if we remove that level, it would move considerable higher up on the scale. That will probably be a good thing. I sort of feel that teaching, I think people naturally gravitate to interpreting the scale as a linear scale. I think teaching people that it's an exponential scale is a bit of an uphill battle. And so it would move considerable where we would like it better. So I think there are some good arguments there for potentially 4 level, but then there's a whole bunch of other challenges around retraining a whole community, having different danger scales in different places, because in Europe, they use the danger scale differently. It's not just a recreational scale. Their level 5 means that roads get closed and villages get evacuated. So I think it's a really challenging topic that would require a lot of thinking and a lot of effort to come up with something that's truly better. And maybe tweaking that scale is not the right way to go. Might be better to stay with that scale, but then provide users that need basic advice with a different product. I think that would be my personal perspective on it at this point in time. But I know people have been debating this for decades. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, since 1996, as soon as the last danger scale came out, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, so maybe a subcommittee will be formed at some point. You can be in charge.
I think Jeff might have a question here for you, Pascal. Feel free to, you're muted, but you can unmute, Jeff.
I'm good, right?
Yep, all good.
Pascal, I'm stuck on this idea of the danger rating scale and people's understanding versus linear and nonlinear. And I really like the approach that you took with sort of, I'm going to call it A/B testing with the aspect and elevation icons. Has there been any thought to doing similar testing on a different icon for the danger rating scale? I mean, I'm looking at it in front of me, and the low, moderate, considerable, high, each box takes the same visual space. They're equal. Have you played around with just a different icon for this?
No, we haven't played around, but it's so Abby is currently like writing up her thesis, and that's in sort of the discussion and recommendation. It is that like the visual representation of that scale in most products gives the impression of a linear scale. In Europe also, they use the numbers quite a bit from 1 to 5. So like, it's really no surprise that people look at it that way. And so maybe there's quite a bit of room for thinking about sort of creative ways to improve that. So if there's any students out there among the audience who's keen, get in touch with me and maybe we can embark on a project like this.
Right, thank you.
Awesome. Anything else to wrap up with Pascal here from any of our panelists? Awesome. Pascal, thank you again. It's been great to have you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with our East Coast community here. I know we have small terrain, but a lot of us travel, and we have some pretty crazy weather too. So it's great to have you talking about this research for our event here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So we are going to do a raffle, and first, really quick, I'm going to play a 1-minute video of from the American Avalanche Association, who is one of our sponsors, and then I'm going to give away a $200 gift card to Ski the Whites in Jackson, which is a pretty sweet prize. I'll phrase that to say I might be playing a video from the American Avalanche Association. Let's see. All right, you know what we're gonna do since we're unprepared for the video? We got it a little last. Oh wait, here we go. If this isn't being seen, somebody let me know. All right, it sounds like people are seeing it, but there's no sound. So what we'll do is we'll come back to this tomorrow night for our final night, and we will have that running for tomorrow. Sorry about that. So without further ado, actually to keep everybody on the line a little longer. So tomorrow night, we'll have our very own Frank Karras presenting about updates from MWAC, and also I believe on an event that happened last year. And that will be followed by a panel of all of our presenters from the last couple days. And it will be a great opportunity to ask some live questions from the audience and talk about some of these topics that have been presented on the last couple days. So we're really excited about that. And we've also saved our biggest raffle prizes for tomorrow. So we hope you join us again tomorrow. Again, you'll see a Zoom link come in either tonight or tomorrow morning for tomorrow's event. So without further ado, congratulations to Benjamin Baum, who is the winner of the $200 Ski the Whites gift card in Jackson. Those guys at Ski the Whites have been a huge supporter of the Avalanche Center over the last several years. They're an amazing local shop that specializes in ski touring equipment. And if you've been following them on social media, you know they get after it pretty hard in the Mount Washington area. So check them out, please. So if there's nothing else, Frank, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up here?
No, I was just going to say thanks for everyone for joining and for continuing to support Mount Washington Avalanche Center and our mission. And we'll see you tomorrow night.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow night.